I lived in Colorado for about 10 years. I have lived in a lot of cities, in fact. I moved around quite a bit in my early adult years. I moved to Colorado from New Mexico, and I moved to New Mexico from North Carolina, where I was stationed in the 82nd Airborne Division. I don't remember the drive to Colorado. I was in somewhat of a fog. I had been released from a mental institution, which was my third such facility that I had been in, not including rehabs, stuff like that. And when I was there, they had prescribed me medication that made it such that I did not know time passing, so I couldn't account for a lot of things. I don't really remember much of being in the facility, and I don't remember the drive, and I don't remember my early days there, and I don't really remember. I don't have much memories until I actually voluntarily took myself off the medication. And if you're wondering what kind of medication, it was Zyprexa, which there's been a number of lawsuits against the maker of Zyprexa. I don't mind sharing that with you. I think the people who are our enemies could find it out anyway if they wanted to use it against me. So it doesn't bother me. There's something about this society that makes you feel like you're coming apart. And I'm not ashamed to admit that I had suffered through that, and to a certain extent, many of us are still dealing with that, myself included. It's not, the society hasn't gone away, right? As those chairs can attest to. So the first, I remember when I first moved there, my brother brought me. He drove from Denver to New Mexico to bring me back to Colorado, to live with him and his family. And the first place that we went to, because I didn't have any clothes, all of my stuff was lost, so I didn't have any clothes. And so we went to Aurora Mall, which is now called Town Center Aurora, which is where the Century 16 Theater is, where the massacre allegedly committed by James Holmes occurred. And at that time, Aurora Mall did not have very many stores. A lot of them were closed up, and it was sort of coming apart, the infrastructure. And it was called, I remember my brother's partner at that time, Demetrius, said, "This is the ghetto mall, this is the black mall." And the patrons are black for the most part. In the mall, it's where we went, and if you've lived in any black neighborhood, or been to any black neighborhood, you see over a period of time disinvestment from those areas, and the infrastructure begins to crumble. This was happening to Aurora Mall. In the early 2000s, it was purchased by Simon Management, and they invested $100 million into the mall, and they were on record, it was recorded, where they were appealing to a white clientele specifically. That's who they wanted. And before that, stores had been closing their gates to black patrons and refusing to service them. And there was a lawsuit was filed, but it was an uproar because this was the one place we went to do our shopping or to hang out or whatever. This is where we went. This was our mall. We didn't own it. We didn't own the stores. We didn't benefit from it, but it was a place that we went to that we didn't have to feel like we were going to be harassed by security, which is what happened once those $100 million were spent to renovate that mall, is the harassment by the security after Simon Management had made it very clear that they did not want us in that mall. The people that live in Aurora now, it's interesting, some of the early black people, there's been black inhabitants in Colorado for a long time, but a lot of the population began moving there after the massacre in the Greenwood section of Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. When some people left, they moved to Colorado, and for a short period of time, there was a black town called Deerfield, Colorado, which began to lose its population around World War II. But some of the people who moved there were from Tulsa. The black section of Denver, when people started migrating to the city, was called 5 Points because 5 streets meet. It was where Manual High School was, where there was a large walkout against segregation in the schools in the city of Denver. It had a long history. Rudolfo Corky Gonzalez, one of the founders of Crusade for Justice and the founder of the Escuela Tlatelolco, and a hero in the Chicanos and the Mexican liberation struggle, went to Manual High School. It has a long history. That's in Northeast Denver in 5 Points. For years, they have been gentrifying it. A couple of years ago, they raided a tamale stand, which was a fixture in the black community called Zonas Tamales. But it was owned by, it served black food, but it also served tamales. And this woman, her son had bought a TV for somebody off the streets, and the cops raided that place and they shut it down. This was part of the process of gentrifying and taking over this neighborhood. Before that, they began closing our schools down and then saying there are not enough children in the middle school after they closed down the primary school to justify keeping it open, closing that down, and then not being enough children going into the high school and then closing that down, reopening them as charter schools eventually that have a lottery system and that don't have the makeup of what the community used to be. A lot of those people that left 5 Points moved to Aurora, Colorado. We still have some black communities in Denver, Park Hill and Montbello, and there's black people scattered all over the place. So when I first heard about the shooting, it was the day that we were leaving North Carolina. And even though I had seen the changes that had happened at the Aurora Mall, I can care less what they call it now, I initially thought that it was targeted against black people, or people in color in general, specifically black people, because of the makeup of what the mall used to be. It took me a while to wrap my mind around it because I spent a great chunk of my adult years there and met a lot of people in the political struggle and made a lot of friends, and I have family that lived there. So before I could be thinking about the political ramifications and the social conditions that created this event, I wanted to call and check on my family, especially my niece, because this movie, The Dark Knight Rises, is one of those movies that the media, that the companies invest a whole lot of money in building up awareness to, and that's why they open the movies the night before and have these midnight showings, because they want to get a jump. And then that's why they actually release the figures from that first night. If you pay attention, they release the figures from the first night showing, so they can begin to plant the seed in people's mind. This is the place you got to be. You got to see this movie. Everybody else is seeing it. Why weren't you there? And this is one of those movies. They don't do it for all the movies. They do it for the ones that they've spent hundreds. And I think Batman, they put like $200 million into that movie. Imagine, $200 million. So I called people and made sure everyone was okay, and especially my niece, who's Diane's age, and everyone was okay. So then started the process of sort of wrapping my mind around it and using my phone to sort of get updated on what was going on. And I found out what most people found out after it occurred, that the young person who allegedly committed it was 24, white male, James Egan Holmes. They began calling him a prodigy, a genius. We heard all of these things, and there was actually a teacher who came out, and I'm not for the tracking that they do with students. They separate students out and say this person is a genius, or they're special, there's something different about them. Everybody else is just kind of regular, but this person doesn't mean that some people don't have certain intelligences because of the conditions they've grown up around, or many different factors that have developed in their mind. But a teacher actually came out and said, no, he was quite normal. He was average. And that doesn't mean anything, but I think it's important to, whenever this comes out, this is what people of color hear, that this person was a genius and they were socially awkward, and it grates on people's minds. Whether it's true or not, it grates on people's minds, because our experience, when we're put on the front page of a paper for allegedly having done something, they don't ascribe those things to us. We're a thug, we're a terrorist, we're a gangster, we're a gangbanger, we're a lowlife. You can imagine, and you've read all the things that we get called when something like this happens. Like Lavelle Mixon, when he went to war with the cops. They couldn't say enough bad things about him. Hassan Shakur in Jersey City, when he went to war with the cops, they couldn't say enough things bad about him. But here's a person who shot 70 people, indiscriminately shot into a crowd of where there were children. But he apparently was able to get his hands on 4 different weapon systems. An AR-15, which was a precursor to the M16, looks just like an M4 carbine. It's a shortened version of an M16. He had 2 .40 caliber Glock pistols, semi-automatics, and a 12-gauge shotgun, 6,000 rounds of ammunition, full tactical gear, which includes, I believe, a Kevlar helmet, leggings, a groin and neck protector, and a vest. He was able to purchase commercial fireworks, along with gallons and gallons of gasoline and other component parts for which bombs were made. An intricate maze of booby traps were set around his apartment. And when the cops showed up, he did not get shot. They arrested him. Now, there was an incident that occurred in Colorado when I lived there of a black man and his partner, his wife, being shot by a white man at a Blockbusters, in a parking lot of a Blockbusters. And his name was Aaron. I can't remember his partner's name. They had just come from a wedding, and a scuffle had broken out between him and the white guy because one person's car hit another. They started arguing. The white man pushed his wife down, and the black guy picked up a stick or something and hit him on the head. And then the white guy, I think he went to his car, retrieved the gun, shot the husband. The wife was still on the ground and shot her in the stomach. When the cops showed up, he was holding the weapon in his hand, and he handed it over to him. They they drove him to the hospital. One of the witnesses, who was an immigrant from Ecuador, was taken and questioned for 4 hours at the police station because she was visibly, and her children and her husband were visibly upset that they did not put this person in handcuffs and they allowed him to go. We found out later that he owned a Blue Bar, which is the bar that cops frequent, called the Hofbrau Bar and Grill. You can imagine if I were holding that gun, what would have happened to me. But back to James Holmes. As we found out, it wasn't any particular grouping that was targeted at the killing, but it was indiscriminately shooting in the theater. Like I said, 12 people were shot, the youngest of which was six. And 12 people were killed, 70 were shot. The youngest person who died was 6 years old. When he first came, he had bought a ticket, walked out the back door, propped it open, came in through I don't know if it was an incendiary device or it was some smoke grenade that he threw to disrupt people, and most people thought it was a prop and didn't think it was real until they heard the screams and the ricocheting of the bullets off of the metal railings. So as more information came out, we found out that he was a college student at the University of Colorado, and that he worked at Anschutz Medical Center in Aurora, which is a new facility. It's about maybe 5-6 years old. And Anschutz himself is a horrible right-wing, ultra-right-wing billionaire whose family made their money in the railroad industry and in petroleum and mining. You should know that. More information began to come out took a couple of days to get into his apartment, and people talked about being able to see his face through the mask and what he looked like when he was arrested and the possible mental illness. And I'd like to, before I go deeper into it, I want people to understand that when I talk about the possible mental illness that he has, that in no way am I trying to imply, nor should it be misconstrued, that this is regular behavior for anyone who suffers from that type of illness, because it is not. Hurt a fly, let alone shoot 70 people who were sitting down to watch a movie. This is a particular case of a person. And having been in mental institutions, I can tell you of the horrible treatment that people who've been diagnosed with certain mental illnesses, especially schizophrenia, receive. Being strapped down and injected and brutalized, and it still goes on to this day. And the stigma that people carry, trying to just maintain and survive, and the medications and what it does, and not that people shouldn't have a right to it, but some of it can just really, like confuse your mind and make things actually seem worse to you. Some of them can be very debilitating. But it would seem that based off of everything we know, based off of there not being any coherent motive, based off of the actions after the arrest, and based off of the revelations that come from the psychiatrist that he was seeing, that he was suffering from some type of mental illness and was most likely delusional and paranoid. And that's not to say that, and neither am I saying that the family should be denied justice and how they define it in this case, but I just want to speak objectively and put out the facts of what happened. I think we know that this was not the first event like this in Colorado. Colorado has, like any place, this country first was founded on massacres and extreme violence. The disappearing of whole peoples and cultures and societies that existed for thousands of years, wiped away by the brutal reality of colonialism in the Western Hemisphere. The slave trade, which itself led to the deaths of millions of people whose bones litter the Atlantic Ocean and who were beaten and brutally murdered once they got here, to build up the foundation from which capitalist system arose, not just in this country, but throughout Europe. Marx called it the primitive accumulation of capital, the means by which capital was raised, not by regular capitalist means. Not from capitalism, but from other means. The seed by which the system springs, or the foundation, I should say. In Colorado, even, there was a massacre of indigenous people. In Sand Creek, there were many more that we never will know about. The massacre, and this was by a territorial militia, the massacre of miners in Ludlow, Colorado, by the National Guard and Rockefeller goons. And then there was another similar massacre by the high school students at Columbine. And the interesting thing about Columbine is it's in a suburb of Denver called Littleton. And the biggest manufacturer in Littleton is Lockheed Martin, a weapons manufacturer. That's not the only one in the Colorado, in the Denver metropolitan area. There's also Northrop Grumman, which has a couple of facilities in the Denver metro area. Denver, outside of Denver, Rocky Flats, which is where nuclear weapons and chemical weapons were manufactured for almost 40 years. And it was a large facility. I think it closed down in the 80s, and for years the workers who would work there, who would develop many different cancers, were denied benefits. And they just won, them and their family members just actually won a court case, I think maybe about 7 years ago. So it took a long time, and many people had passed away since then. Colorado is also home of NORAD. It is the home of the Air Force Academy, and it is the home of the largest and most technologically advanced infantry division in all the military, the 4th Infantry Division. There's also a number of missile silos that are there. So it has a particular history of being a very militarized place. ever since it was stolen away from the Mexican people in that brutal war to extend the slave states further west. And they stole Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, California, Nevada. More than half of 60% of what was Mexico was stolen away, probably more than that, through a brutal war waged by the U.S. I think it's important that when we speak, a lot of what you see in the bourgeois media wants to make this seem it's an isolated event. Like it's just a case of some person who was severely mentally ill just losing it and killing a bunch of people. And maybe people have forgotten about the recent string of massacres. Maybe they've forgotten about Columbine, and maybe they've forgotten about Virginia Tech, and the many that we see, and they seem to be happening much more frequently. But we have to ask ourselves, where do they come from then? A lot of which I've already described, the particular history of the U.S., cannot be separated from these events. This is the context, this is the backdrop of which these events happen. But there's also the society that's what springs up in any capitalist society. The alienation of workers from the product that they produce and the means of production. Being involved in a whole process of which they get no satisfaction other than their wage. They don't own the product. They don't own the system. It's owned by somebody else, and they participate in it to subsist, to make a subsistence wage for them and their family members. Over a period of time, that alienation spreads into how you relate to one another, family members, friends, the whole society, not feeling as if you're in control of your own destiny. And it has an effect socially. It seeps into society and has an effect. And this is from which these things, along with the violence of building the U.S. society, from which, it found the U.S. got its wealth and became the predominant imperialist power in the entire world, and the way in which it's maintained it. The last 12 years of war, the U.S. has been at constant war, in fact, since its inception. The capitalist system itself is nothing but a war, sometimes open and sometimes hidden. But exploitation itself is violent. It's a violent process. And if no one understands that, if you don't understand that, then you just go to a picket line and you just go see workers fighting over a contract, or you go talk to someone who's newly laid off. That's a violent process, and you're left to your own devices to figure out how you are going to survive. And whether you know it or not, whether you know the particular history of events in this country, it's in the atmosphere, it's in the ether. You can't help but breathe it in. You can't help but absorb it, and it has some effect on you and how you relate to one another and relate to the society in general. It's funny about in the U.S. how the media and the right wing talks about the sanctity of marriage and the sanctity of family and all of that. Well, how sanctified can it be when you have to be in competition with your very family members for survival? Has anyone ever had the experience of applying for the same job as a family member? You ever had that experience? You're in competition with your brother or your sister, or your mother or your father for your survival. That's what it is. So this whole garbage about how the family, they don't give a damn about families. If you cared about families and maintaining a family, which is a bourgeois concept anyway, but if you cared about it, you would give people the essentials for which to survive and love one another. And this society does not do that. You are left to your own devices to starve or to die. A slow starvation or a quick death, that's what they leave you in this society. It cares nothing about anybody other than perpetuating this brutal, racist, ugly, homophobic, sexist ass system. That's what they care about. That's the foundation from which this springs. That's what we have to begin to get out there and communicate with people. That's why I wrote the article, and if I didn't do it, somebody else would have done it. Because that's our job as revolutionary Marxists, is to analyze phenomena as they happen using the dialectical method for which to do so. Because if we don't do it, it's not as if we have access to the mainstream media, but people will be left to forget this event and not tie it to what's actually happening in the society in general, and to begin to talk about those things. You see, I believe the family should have justice. I'm not for the death penalty in the U.S. system, because it will always be used against poor people and people of color in a society. I defend the right of countries who are under siege of U.S. imperialism to decide for themselves and to use it if they deem it necessary. But in the U.S., I ain't for it. So you can't get me to say they should kill that young man. I think the family deserves justice however they define it, and most likely that would be that the young man will get life in prison, but that will be a hollow justice, because we'll be talking about the next massacre maybe a year from now, or maybe a few months now. We'll be left to analyze that. The only way that we can begin to heal the deep psychic damage that the system does to people is to overthrow it. Gone way past my time, but I think the important point to take from this and from this particular massacre, and for how to speak to people who want to talk about it, because for a brief point in time it was on everybody's mind, and then the Olympics started and people were consumed with that, is to just tell people that these things are not isolated events. They don't spring out of nothingness, but they come from real material social conditions that exist in bourgeois society, specifically U.S. bourgeois society, and that they will not start to disappear, and we cannot start the healing process until we overthrow that bourgeois society for a humane society, a society built off of solidarity and built off of providing for people's needs, and that society is a socialist society. Thank you.